Hello, my friends. How are you today? I want to share something with you. A story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about second chances. About the mysterious ways life weaves our paths together, even when we think we're walking alone. Sometimes, the universe places us exactly where we need to be, in rooms we never wanted to enter, facing people we never thought we'd see again. Sometimes, the hands that offer healing belong to hearts that were once broken by the very person they're now trying to save. What would you do if fate asked you to care for someone who once left you behind? What if forgiveness wasn't a choice you made with your mind, but something that happened quietly, in the space between one breath and the next? Today's story is about a young woman who discovered that our deepest wounds can become our greatest gifts. That sometimes, the person we become is shaped not in spite of our pain, but because of it. So settle in, take a deep breath, and let your heart open to this journey. Because what you're about to witness will remind you that love finds a way, even when we think it's too late. Let's follow this remarkable story together. Every morning at 6:30, Maya Chen would stand at her kitchen window, watching the world wake up while her coffee grew cold in her hands. She had this ritual, this quiet moment where she'd close her eyes and prepare herself for another day of carrying other people's pain. Maya was 28, but something in her eyes made her seem both older and younger at the same time. Older because of the weight she carried. Younger because of the gentleness that never left her voice, no matter how tired she became. Her neighbors knew her as the kind woman who always asked about their grandchildren, who left homemade soup on doorsteps when someone was sick. Her colleagues at the nursing agency called her their angel, the one they sent to the most difficult cases because she had this gift of making people feel seen, even in their darkest moments. But what they didn't know was that Maya's compassion came from a place of deep understanding. She knew what it felt like to be forgotten, to wonder if anyone would notice if you just disappeared. She had learned to heal others because she was still trying to heal the little girl inside herself, the one who used to wait by the window, believing that maybe today her father would come back. Every evening, she'd return to her small apartment and sit in the same chair where her grandmother used to read to her. The chair where she first learned that love could fill some empty spaces, but not all of them. Maya had built her entire life around being the person she needed when she was 3 years old. The person who stays, who cares, who never gives up. She had no idea that tomorrow, the universe would ask her to face the very reason she became who she was. Maya's days had a rhythm to them, like a gentle song she'd been humming for years without realizing it. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she'd drive her old Honda Civic through the same streets, past the coffee shop where the owner always waved, past the park where children played on swings that reminded her of afternoons that felt like lifetimes ago. She kept her nursing bag in the passenger seat, organized with the same care she put into everything else. Bandages folded just so, medication sorted by time of day, a small lavender spray that she'd learned could calm even the most anxious patients. Maya dressed simply but thoughtfully. Soft cardigans in muted colors, comfortable shoes that wouldn't echo too loudly on hospital floors, hair pulled back in a way that felt professional but approachable. She had learned that in her line of work, everything mattered. The way you knocked on a door, the tone of your voice when you asked about pain levels, even the way you folded a blanket could mean the difference between trust and fear. Her phone would buzz throughout the day with messages from the agency, new assignments, schedule changes, updates on patients she'd grown attached to. Maya had this habit of keeping a small notebook where she'd write down little things. Mrs. Henderson loved stories about her garden. Mr. Rodriguez felt less anxious when she hummed quietly while checking his vitals. 13-year-old Emma smiled more when Maya wore the cardigan with tiny flowers on it. At lunch, she'd sit in her car and call her grandmother, the woman who raised her after, well, after everything changed. They'd talk about recipes and neighborhood gossip, but never about the empty spaces that still echoed in Maya's heart. Some conversations were too heavy for a Tuesday afternoon. The nursing agency respected Maya deeply. She was the one they called for their most challenging cases. The patients who'd given up hope, the families who'd lost faith in the system. Maya had this way of walking into a room and making it feel less lonely, less frightening. She'd sit by bedsides and listen to stories that others were too busy to hear, hold hands that others were too afraid to touch. But Maya never spoke about her own story, never mentioned why she understood loneliness so intimately, or why she could recognize abandonment in someone's eyes from across a room. She just did her work, drove home to her quiet apartment, and prepared for tomorrow. Another day of healing wounds that weren't so different from her own. She had no way of knowing that tomorrow's assignment would be different, that the address on her clipboard would lead her to a door she'd been both running from and searching for her entire life. The address was 1247 Maple Grove Drive. Maya had written it down twice, checking her handwriting because her hands had started trembling for reasons she couldn't explain. She pulled into the driveway of a house that looked familiar. Not in the way a place looks familiar when you've driven past it 100 times, but familiar in the way a childhood nightmare feels familiar. The white shutters, the oak tree in the front yard, the stone pathway that led to a door she'd stood behind as a 3-year-old, waiting for someone who never came back. Maya sat in her car for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Her heart was doing this thing, this violent flutter that made her wonder if this was what panic felt like. She'd helped patients through panic attacks before, but she'd never understood the way your own body could become a stranger to you in a single moment. The assignment sheet said Robert Sullivan, age 52, terminal diagnosis, requiring full-time care. But Maya knew that name. She'd whispered it into her pillow as a child, written it on school forms in the space marked Father's Name, crossed it out, written unknown instead. She knocked on the door because that's what professionals do. They knock on doors even when their entire world is shifting beneath their feet. The man who answered? Maya had to grip the doorframe to keep from falling. 25 years changes a person, but not their eyes. Not the way they tilt their head when they're confused. Not the small scar above their left eyebrow from a childhood accident their daughter had heard about in bedtime stories told by a grandmother who tried to fill impossible spaces. "You must be the nurse," he said, and his voice was exactly the same. The voice that used to read her stories, that used to promise he'd be right back, that used to say, "Daddy loves you," before it disappeared forever. Maya heard herself say, "Yes, I'm Maya Chen," and watched no recognition cross his face. None. 25 years of wondering, of searching faces in crowds, of building an entire life around the absence he'd left behind. And she was nothing more than a stranger hired to keep him comfortable while he prepared to leave this world. The irony was suffocating. The little girl he'd abandoned had grown up to become the one person who could help him through his final days. And he had no idea. None at all. Maya stepped into that house, carrying her nursing bag and 25 years of questions she'd never thought she'd have the chance to ask. Days blurred into nights. Maya would drive home from Robert's house and sit in her car in the driveway, unable to move, unable to breathe properly. The weight of the secret was crushing her from the inside out. She'd been caring for him for 2 weeks now. 2 weeks of checking his medications, adjusting his pillows, listening to him ramble in his fever-induced delirium about regrets that cut through her like glass. He would cry out in his sleep, calling for someone named Maya, his little girl, the daughter he'd lost, the daughter he'd thrown away. But it was the quiet moments that destroyed her the most. When the pain medication would clear his mind just enough for him to be present, really present. He'd look at her with such gratitude, such genuine kindness, and say things like, "You remind me of someone I used to know," or "You have gentle hands, just like..." And then he'd trail off, lost in memories that included her, but would never recognize her. One evening, Maya found herself standing in her grandmother's old bedroom, staring at a shoebox she hadn't opened in years. Inside were the letters. Dozens of them. Letters her father had written to her grandmother, begging for updates about Maya's life. Pictures he'd sent, school clothes he'd bought and mailed, hoping they'd reach her. Birthday cards signed, "Love, Daddy," that her grandmother had hidden away, thinking she was protecting Maya from more disappointment. Maya sank to the floor, surrounded by evidence of a love she'd never known existed. 25 years of believing she'd been forgotten. 25 years of building walls around her heart. And here was proof that he'd been thinking of her all along. Not enough to come back, but enough to never stop caring. She found herself crying for the first time in years. Not the careful, controlled tears she allowed herself when Patience passed away, but the deep, body-shaking sobs of a 3-year-old who'd been waiting by the window for someone who was too broken to come home. The cruelest part wasn't that he'd left. It was that he'd never stopped loving her, and she'd never stopped loving him. And now they were in the same room every day. And he was dying without knowing that his little girl had grown up to be exactly the kind of person he'd hoped she'd become. Maya realized that all these years, she'd been preparing for this moment. Every patient she'd comforted, every hand she'd held, every family she'd helped through loss. It had all been practice for learning how to love someone who'd hurt you, how to care for someone you'd spent a lifetime resenting. The question that haunted her nights wasn't whether she should tell him who she was. The question was whether she was brave enough to let herself be his daughter again, even if it was only for a few precious weeks. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon when the light was streaming through Robert's bedroom window in a way that reminded Maya of her grandmother's kitchen. He was having one of his clearer days, sitting up in bed, looking through an old photo album with trembling hands. "I used to read to her every night," he whispered, not to Maya but to the memory itself. She had this little laugh, like bells ringing. I can still hear it sometimes. Maya was adjusting his IV when she saw it. There, tucked between the pages of his album, was a small piece of paper. Yellowed with age, creased from being folded and unfolded countless times. She recognized her grandmother's handwriting immediately. It was a quote her grandmother had loved, something she'd written down and kept close during the hardest years of raising Maya alone. The words that had guided them both through the loneliness, through the questions that had no easy answers. "The wound is the place where the light enters you." Maya's hands stilled. She'd heard those words her entire life, whispered by her grandmother during bedtime prayers, spoken softly after difficult days at school when other children asked about her father. Maya had grown up believing they were about her wound, her abandonment, her need to find light in the darkness. But looking at Robert now, seeing the way he clutched that paper like a lifeline, she realized the light had been entering through his wound too. All these years, they'd both been carrying the same sacred hurt, the same desperate hope that love could survive even the deepest mistakes. The truth settled over Maya like a gentle rain. She hadn't become a healer despite her father's absence. She'd become a healer because of it. And he hadn't kept that quote because he'd forgotten about her. He'd kept it because he'd never stopped praying that somehow, somewhere, light was still finding its way into the spaces his leaving had torn open. In that moment, Maya understood. The wound wasn't just hers to carry, it belonged to both of them. And maybe, just maybe, the light that had been trying to enter all these years was this sacred opportunity to heal together what had been broken apart. The next morning, Maya found herself doing something she hadn't done in 25 years. She brought her father breakfast and sat beside his bed, not as his nurse, but as someone who wanted to hear his stories. "Tell me about her," she said quietly, gesturing to the photo of the little girl with pigtails. "Tell me about your daughter." Robert's eyes filled with a light she'd never seen before. For the first time since she'd walked into his house, he wasn't talking to his caregiver. He was talking to someone who truly wanted to listen. He spoke about tiny hands that used to trace the letters in bedtime stories, about a laugh that could fill an entire room, about the way she used to fall asleep on his chest while he hummed old songs. Maya listened to her father describe the little girl she used to be, and for the first time, she didn't feel angry about what was lost. She felt grateful for what had been loved. Days began to change between them. Maya would arrive earlier, leave later. She'd bring flowers from her grandmother's garden, the same garden where she'd played as a child. She'd read to him from books he'd once read to her, though he didn't know that the stories were traveling full circle. Robert began to improve in small ways. Not physically. His condition remained the same. But something in his spirit was healing. He smiled more, slept more peacefully, spoke with less regret in his voice. It was as if being truly seen, truly heard by someone who cared, was medicine for a wound that had been bleeding for decades. Maya realized she was healing too. The anger that had lived in her chest since childhood was being replaced by something softer. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. She was beginning to see that her father hadn't left because he didn't love her. He'd left because he didn't know how to love himself enough to stay. And in learning to care for him without bitterness, Maya was learning to care for the wounded parts of herself with the same gentle compassion she'd always given to others. The light was finally entering through the wound, just as her grandmother had always believed it would. 3 weeks later, Robert passed away peacefully in his sleep. Maya was holding his hand when he took his final breath, and in those last moments, she whispered the words she'd carried in her heart for 25 years. "It's okay, Daddy. I'm here." Whether he heard her, whether some part of him knew, that's a mystery Maya carries gently now, like a secret that belongs to both of them. Maya still works as a nurse. She still arrives early and stays late, still brings flowers to brighten sterile rooms, still listens to stories that others don't have time to hear. But something has changed in the way she sees her patients, and the way she sees herself. She understands now that we're all carrying wounds that shaped us, all searching for light in the places that hurt the most. Every person she cares for is someone's abandoned child, someone's regretful parent, someone's unfinished love story. Maya learned that healing isn't always about fixing what's broken. Sometimes it's about loving what's wounded until it doesn't hurt quite so much. Sometimes it's about showing up for people who once couldn't show up for us, not because they deserve it, but because we do. The little girl who waited by the window grew up to become the woman who stays by bedsides. The daughter who felt forgotten became the caregiver who ensures no one leaves this world alone. Maybe that's what grace looks like. Not perfect people doing perfect things, but wounded people choosing to love anyway. Maybe the light really does enter through our cracks, and maybe, just maybe, the person we become because of our pain is exactly the person the world needs us to be. What wounds have shaped the compassion in your own heart? And who in your life might be waiting for a love that doesn't require them to earn it, but simply receives them as they are?